Hi, I'm Goose, and welcome back to Design in Minecraft. I put together all of the basic videos for you in one spot here, so you can see all of them in once and get a little bit more context. But I also have two very exciting announcements. One of them I'll get out of the way now, and the other one will be at the end of the video so that you have to stick around. You know how that is. But first off, the first building competition in our Discord server is over, and we have a few winners. The way we did this is we have a community-voted favorite, and then we have a judged winner. We had 6 judges judging all of the entries, and we decided on one final. And we also have 2 honorable mentions because they are really cool, and we had a really hard time deciding between those 2 and the winner. So we're going to start with the honorable mentions. First up, we have this build right here by Koi over in the Discord. I really like this one. Awesome build. And the other honorable mention is this robot by Seijayo, also in the Discord, and has a YouTube channel. I'll link that down below and up in the corner. So congrats to both of you guys for the honorable mentions. These are both fantastic builds and really cool stuff. Next up, we have our community voted favorite, and that is going to Wemzy. Wemzy has been in the Discord pretty much since the beginning, and this is a really cool build. I particularly like how much ore they use. You don't see a lot of ore in builds, and it was cool to see. And last but certainly not least, we have the judged winner of the competition. Now, this was 6 judges that decided on this one out of all, I think, about 23, 25 entries. And that winner is FaerieEnderHare. I'm going to link their Instagram here and their YouTube. These will both be down in the description. But look at this build. Look at that. That's a cool build. Seriously, really awesome build. Very proud of you. You did a great job. Go check out their stuff. It's great. So, without further ado, please enjoy all of the design videos thrown into one. Hope you like it, and stick around at the end for another announcement. See ya! Shape is one of the most basic elements of design, and it is pretty self-explanatory. It's just different shapes. Changing the shape of a build, or changing the shapes that you use in elements of the build, can have a dramatic effect on how it looks overall. For example, there's a difference between making a building tall and thin, or short and square. We have a skyscraper and a warehouse, and something like that can be conveyed simply by changing the shape. Making a triangle just a little taller and a little bit thinner at the base can take it from Egyptian to, let's say, a lighthouse or a fountain. This applies to elements inside of a build as well. If you take a door that's a square and turn it into a circle, makes a pretty big difference. Same thing if you have a window that's an oval. That gives a dramatically different effect than if you have square or rectangle windows. When you change the parameters of a shape, what you're doing is changing the silhouette. You can think of a silhouette kind of like a filled-in outline without any detail. You can have silhouettes of 2D objects. You can also have silhouettes of 3D objects. We're going to be talking mostly about the silhouettes of 3D objects in this video. Silhouettes are one of the most important principles of design when it comes to making things recognizable and identifiable. You most often hear about silhouettes in things like character design. Overwatch was an amazing example of this. Every single character was easily identifiable simply by their silhouette. But this doesn't only apply to character design. I'm sure most of you can tell me right away what this is. This is the Deep Frost Citadel built by Tango Tech in Season 9 of Hermitcraft for Decked Out 2. You don't always have to be familiar with something to understand it too. For example, this one. I bet you thought those looked like ears, and you were right. This is a fantastic build by Meg Ray. I'm going to link the video right here because it's a really cool video, really cool build. But you don't even need to see the entire silhouette of the building to think, oh, I think that looks like an animal head. Here's another great example from Gray's Sun. Even though you may not be able to tell that this is a mushroom house, just by that little curl on top with the lantern hanging off of it, you probably get the vibe that this is more of a mystical or fantasy style cottagecore, mushroomy kind of build. Working with silhouettes in Minecraft can get kind of tricky because we're not only working in a 2D space, we're working in a 3D space, so you have to think about the silhouette from all angles. This is where we move from shape into form. Shape only has 2 dimensions, height and width. When you add the third dimension, depth, you move from shape into form. You go from 2D into 3D. The most basic form in Minecraft is a cube, one single block. Everything in the game is going to be made out of these. We do have things that are smaller than one block, but when you really get down to it, they're also just made up of more blocks. Using this block, we can make any form that we want to. Because the blocks in Minecraft are fairly large, we consider these low-resolution forms. You know that this is a sphere, but when you really look at it, It's not actually round. By increasing the resolution, or the size and the amount of blocks, we can have a lot more detail and make things look a lot more round. While this does take a lot more blocks, it gives you a lot more opportunity for defining a form with different qualities like rough or smooth or round or jagged, things like that. In a 3D sense, texture only applies to form, not to shape. Now, I'm not talking about the texture of the block, I'm talking about the texture of the build, whether something is rough or bumpy or smooth. Thinking about those kind of qualities before you build something can really help you get the details down a lot quicker. If you're doing a modern, sleek build, then you're not going to want things to be rough and jagged. You're going to want things to be more smooth. If you're doing, let's say, some old ruins, you know that things are going to be crumbling, they're going to be broken, and you can lean into that by using more texture, more blocks in different places, and keeping things rough and jagged. Form applies to everything you build. Every single thing in the game is going to have form. If you're trying to replicate things in real life, really taking a moment to study that object and look at what is the form like, what is the quality like, is going to help you choose your palette, it's going to help you choose your shapes, and the quality of those shapes and forms when you're building. Using basic forms to break up a build can be really helpful, especially when you're dealing with organics. For example, let's say you're building a skull. This is a very basic shape, but it's just a sphere with half of a cylinder hanging off the front. This is a great starting point for sculpting something like a skull. And spruce trees are essentially tall pyramids sitting on top of a stick. Form, shape, and silhouette can all have a monumental impact on your builds, so it's important to pay attention to them. So this week, I want you to take one of your builds, or even a build by somebody else that you can put in your creative world, and really look at the silhouette. Replacing every block with black concrete can be a good way to do this, but you don't have to. Just looking and observing the silhouette and the shapes used, maybe change a few of them around and see how it affects the build. I'm going to put a link to my Discord down below, and I would love to have you come and share your build or share whatever you're working on. And as always, this is a very basic overview, so if you have other questions or if you have something you want to discuss about this, please come on over and ask. I'd be happy to see you there. When I talk about balance and emphasis, I'm going to use a lot of words like weight and heavy and light. I want to make it clear that I'm not talking about the weight like kilograms or pounds of the materials. I'm talking about the amount of focus and attention that an element of a build pulls. For example, we have a spruce door, and this blends in and harmonizes with this pretty well, but if we put a warped door in there, there's a lot of contrast in the color there, and there's some contrast in the texturing. So now I would say that that door has more weight than this one over here, simply because of the contrast of colors and materials. Weight can also be changed by the placement of something in a build. For example, I just moved this door to the right a little bit. It has a different feel, it has a different balance. One way of looking at it is that this side is now heavier because it's the only side with a door. Or you could say that this blank space is drawing your attention, so there's too much weight over here, and we needed something over here to balance it out. If we really start moving things around, an image can become very unbalanced. This isn't a bad thing. If you want something to look a little more chaotic or worn down or unique or stand out, having things very off balance can be beneficial. Just like all the principles that I talk about, there is no right or wrong way to use them. What we're doing is practicing and learning tools that will help us describe the choices that we make. Having a door in the center is not better than having a door over here, but there may be a reason you want things to be symmetrical versus off balance. Understanding the difference that that movement of the door can make is going to help you make better, more informed, and more articulated choices in your builds and in anything that you're designing. Over here, I have a few different examples of walls and entryways. This is to show you how changing the balance in an element can change how it feels. This is also to show you that sometimes having an off-balance thing can increase emphasis. There's a major crossover between emphasis and balance. Right here, we just have a symmetrical wall, and it looks good, it looks uniform, there's nothing wrong with this. Over here, we moved one of the pillars over, and we put a larger window here. Now, this does bring more attention to the window, it also brings more attention to these pillars over here. This may be useful if you want to create more emphasis on a certain wall or a certain area of a building. We did the same thing over here, except with an entryway. I am not a big fan of symmetrical entryways because they really look like faces. I mean, it's hard to avoid faces in Minecraft, but symmetrical entryways really are heavy on the faces. By offsetting the door and window in a build like this, It can make what I think is a little bit more of a welcoming entrance. You can put some garden here. You can, change things. You can have a little bit more visibility into the house. It gives you a little bit more options for detailing, in my opinion. Over here, we're showing the change in balance with the color as well with the placement of the doors. Because I moved the door to the left on this side, it left this wall feeling off. I'm going to put it back to the sandstone so you can see. Although the point was to show something that was off balance, I felt like this was too off balance. So in order to balance it out, what I did was I pulled some of the colors that are on the left side that are very heavy into the right side to create a little bit more balance and a little bit more weight on the right side. Details like plants and trees can be really useful when you want to use balance to emphasize a certain area or lead people into a certain area. Over here we have more detail. We have the stones and the vines, we have the water, and the tree over here puts a lot of weight on this side, which is good because we want someone to go and focus in on this area, but we don't want the left side to be so blank and so spacious that that draws your eye away from this. Sometimes the empty space has more weight than the detail. So I used a clump of trees to kind of block this area off and keep that balanced while still keeping an emphasis right here. You can use contrast and color the same way to show emphasis or to change the balance of a scene. Maybe in this room, the yellow is overwhelming, so we want to tone it down by putting an emphasis of a different color. Now that we only have one new color in here, that becomes an accent. The room before was overwhelmingly yellow, and putting a little accent can both add more attention to the yellow because there's contrast, but it can also help balance it out a little bit. If we want to balance it even more, we can bring the blue into other areas of the room. The more we add, the more balanced the scene becomes. Now, I would say this room is still overwhelmingly yellow, but having a very high contrast color like blue really does help balance it out, even though it's creating more contrast. And contrast is just one way to create balance or emphasis. This can be contrast in size, this can be contrast in shape, in color, in placement. We have an empty space here, contrasted with a dark, detailed space here, or we have very contrasting colors in here. The varying style of builds in Minecraft can be great for creating emphasis and balance if you want to. Let's say you have some players coming into a town and they need to find, the witch or warlock's house. Oh gee, I wonder which one it is. Balance and emphasis can be very helpful when you're theming a build as well. You want something to look like a shrine or a temple. Going with a symmetrical build can be a very good idea. If we want something to look a little more run down, well used, and utilitarian, avoiding symmetry can be very helpful. Something else that happens when you avoid symmetry is it looks like there are more items. When things are symmetrical, our brain tends to put them in groups and kind of cancels the other one out. We see 2 groups instead of 4 items. But when things are varied and asymmetrical, our brain sees everything as its own individual object. It can make things look a lot more natural and a lot less intentionally placed. This is very important when you're doing terraforming or making things look natural. Now, this is a little scene that I made that we're going to be coming back to a few times in the series, especially in composition. But I want to point out that balance and emphasis can be very important when you want a scene to be viewed from a specific angle. I have the trees on each side framing this image, and this path leads the eye up. The orange and the glass is a great contrast, but the slope of the building kind of matches the slope of the mountains, and it follows the mountains up. This leads the eye from here right to the building and creates a pretty well framed and composed image. We'll be coming back to talk more about this build in line, movement, and composition. All of the elements of design really go hand in hand. There's going to be a lot of crossover in these videos, but we're going to pull everything together in the end when we finally get to composition. In the meantime, see how you can change the overall feel and vibe of a build by changing the balance or by putting emphasis on a specific element. Line is the most basic element of design. Even shapes are just lines put together in different ways. There are a lot of different qualities that we can change within line to change the way that they appear. Starting from the left, we have solid line, broken lines, curved lines, and then different weights or thicknesses of lines. We'll go over examples for all of these in just a moment. I was really surprised when I was setting these up at how many different weights of line we can do with just some of the basic blocks. We're starting over here with iron bars, glass, fences, walls, banners, blocks, and then double blocks. That's quite a lot of variation that you can get with just a few different items. Even the hanging signs give a pretty interesting textured line. And a huge shout out to FaerieEnderHareMC for this image right here. We'll be going over this more in a second. There are a lot of different ways to change the thickness of lines in increments using trapdoors and signs. In terms of horizontal lines, we're starting with trapdoors, slabs, slab and trapdoor, sign and slab. We get a little bit more overhang than we do if we just use the trapdoor. Full blocks with trapdoors, and you can keep combining those on and on to create almost any variation and thickness of a horizontal line. You can do these with diagonal lines as well. Now this is where this image comes in, and I thought this was really interesting because all of these are different thickness of steps and different weight of line, but all of them are still on the same slope, meaning they're parallel and they're not going to run into each other. None of them are steeper than the other one. Now, you don't have to keep them on the same slope. Going back to FaerieEnderHareMC, here are some amazing examples of how you can combine all these techniques to create some beautiful curves and line work in Minecraft. Here we have some examples of the different qualities of lines and how they can apply to builds. Solid lines are very graphic, they're very simple and straightforward. They tend to look modern depending on the palette you use, so we can add a little bit of variation with some different lines below it, but these are very graphic and straightforward. Broken lines can be great when you want things to imply that there was something there that's no longer there, or maybe that something is moving. This is a trick I see a lot with glass panes and walls to make structures look like they're floating, or they've broken off from something, or maybe that they're actually in motion. Curved lines are most often used in terrain, although we can implement these into builds just as well. Here's an example showing different weight of lines in a build. You can see that with only a few blocks, you can get a lot of variation. This can add to the complexity and detail and depth of a wall or building or whatever it is that you're working on. Same goes for this build. There are a lot of different ways to work in different weights and quality of line to make your builds look different. One of the most common places that we're going to see diagonals is on roofs. There are a lot of different ways to do roofs, and these are just some very, very basic silhouettes. But by mixing and matching the block types, and the trapdoors, and the signs, and the angle, we can make almost an infinite amount of different roof silhouettes. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about movement, and then we're going to work line into movement as well. There are 3 types of movement that we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss actual movement, implied movement, and perceptual movement. Starting with actual movement, it is actual movement. This is mostly going to be seen in redstone contraptions like mine carts, water streams, dispensers. This is when things are actually moving. Bubble columns, dripstone, particle effects, lights. All of these things are actual movement because things are actually moving. These can add a lot to a scene, especially if they're used subtly. Tango's build this season of Hermitcraft is an excellent example of using actual movement to enhance a building. Almost everything in his factory goes through some sort of visual, actual movement, even though it's not necessary for it to get done what it needs to get done. It adds a lot, and it really makes it feel like a factory. I really recommend going and checking out his most recent episode to see more of what I'm talking about. I'll link that in the description below. Up next is implied movement. Implied movement is when we imply that there is movement even though things are stationary. In these 2 examples, we have a tree being blown by the wind, and we also have smoke drifting off in the wind. Now, both of these would have the same implied movement of moving from right to left, being moved by the wind, even though they're very different builds. Here's an awesome example of implied movement and of line work by Wordle. I want you to pay attention to the drips and how they really do look like they're in motion, and this is just a freeze frame of something that was actually moving. This is an excellent example of implied movement and of line work. Now, perceptual movement gets a little bit trickier. Perceptual movement is the movement that your eye makes around a scene. This is where we start to involve line with movement a little bit more. For example, we have a waterfall that starts at the top and goes down. Your eye probably focuses at the top first and then follows the water down. It's a very simple, straight line of perceptual movement. We can vary perceptual movement and guide the eye in different ways. For example, we add a ledge that makes the waterfall curve as it goes down. This makes it a little bit more interesting, and this adds a little bit more perceptual movement to a scene. Now, when we really want to work with perceptual movement, we can work with placements of different objects within a scene as a whole to force a viewer to look at things from a certain angle and view things at a certain time. We're going to be talking about this a lot when we talk about composition, but for now, here's a simple scene to show you what I mean. Using simple things like paths and boulders, we can direct a person to view and walk through a scene in a certain way. Our view is blocked by this, and we see that the path goes around, so naturally we're going to follow the path and turn around this corner. Now here's the first scene. This is the first glimpse of what the focus of the scene is going to be, but we still have it blocked by another mountain. Now this puts some interest in there, puts a little bit of contrast, but it also pulls the eye down to the right where the path continues. This draws the viewer in and makes them want to continue walking around the path until they get to the reveal, which is the focal point of our scene. Now in this example, imagine this is a hill with a build on top of the hill, staircase coming down, and we have a waterfall going down as well. This is just a very simple layout with different colors and shapes to show you the example. At this point, when we're here, this becomes the focal point of the entire scene. This is where you're going to put in the most work with detailing. You have a lot of things pulling the eye up. You have some things pulling the eye back down. And it's going to really let the eye linger around this area and appreciate all the detail that you put into it. Now, B-Dubs is really, really good at this, and he's really good at explaining it too. At the time of recording this, his most recent video has an excellent explanation of this. So I'm going to link that up in the top right. I'm also going to link that down in the description. I'm sure a lot of you guys have already seen it, but it is awesome. I recommend going and viewing it again with all of this in context. Now, do you remember this scene? Hopefully this makes a little bit more sense now that I've shown you that other example, but this path is a great way to lead the eye up, around, and to the house, which is the focal point of the scene. Now we used line in a few different ways to make this a little more cohesive. We have a diagonal line that flattens out for the roof, and we kind of follow that line on the mountains, but then we contrast it as well to meet the top of the house. We have an empty space underneath the house with some darker shadows, but we use some green and some bushes in front to add some contrast to that and not let that take too much of the attention. This scene really invites you to walk up the path and spiral around here, appreciate the detail that's on both sides, and pull you up into the final build. We use the trees as lines to frame the image and turn it into one cohesive composition. Movement comes into play all the time in composition, whether it's actual movement, implied movement, or perceptual movement. Perceptual movement takes a lot of practice to really get down, but that's all you need to do. You just got to practice. Take a build and see if there's something you can add to obstruct something, or maybe raise something up, and watch how your eye moves around the build. Ask a friend to look at it and see what they think as well. You don't have anyone to look at your builds? Well, guess what? I have a Discord, link is down below, and share your build, share your stuff, come say hi. This is going to be a pretty quick one because scale is pretty straightforward and easy to understand, but there are a few examples that I want you to see that might help put things into perspective. To start, we have things lined up from smallest to largest going up to just a block, and I believe the smallest detail thing that you can do in Minecraft is to put a button on an invisible item frame. If anybody knows anything that is smaller than that, let me know, but I'm pretty sure that is as small as it gets. Outside of things and item frames, the button is going to be the smallest, and from there, we can go up to a normal block. This is pretty basic, but it's just to see out of the basic building blocks that we have a pretty good amount of variation. Now let's say you want to make an entrance to a mine. Other than a hole, this is about as general as you can get. It's just a hole with a tiny bit of decoration around it. When we increase the size a little bit, we can add more detail, we can add a little bit more variation, and it adds a little bit more interest. Now if we really increase the size, it makes it more of a landmark. Now, this is a cave that you might want to explore and go into, and it might not just be a mine entrance. This is where you move a little bit more into terraforming and things like that. But as always, we can bump the scale up as big as we want. And right here, we have a pretty big cave. Now, it's going to give a much different feel. This probably isn't going to be a mine entrance unless you have a huge mine, and it's probably not going to be something that you're going to want to just waltz into. It's a very foreboding, overshadowing, large feature, and all of that can be achieved just by changing the scale. This can be applied to elements within a build as well. For example, I have some windows here. We're starting with a small one that's just one pane of glass, going up to a very large, more ornate window. As the scale of the window increases, you can add a lot more detail, and it also creates a much different feel in a build. This can be useful with narrative as well. If you have someone who lives in a very wealthy house, they're probably not going to have small windows like this. They're going to have more windows like these. When you're working with scale, it's also important to pay attention to the empty space. The empty space can have a lot of weight in a build, and it can really change how things are viewed. If we throw this tiny window up on a big blank wall, it just doesn't feel right. But it does have its uses. On this tower over here, if we have just one small window, it looks more like a defensive tower, something where someone would shoot arrows out of that, or perhaps a prison. Maybe there's something held up in there that someone doesn't want you to get to. But if we increase the scale of the window, It takes it away from the defensive prison look and more into something that is for decoration. This is probably something you would see in a courtyard or a church or a main tower of a castle, rather than something on the outskirts that's used for defense. I know that wasn't much, but when it comes to scale, that's about it. It's about how big things are and how putting varying sizes can change the way that something looks and feels. So what exactly is composition? Well, composition is the balancing of principles and elements within a project. When I say principles and elements, I mean things like color and emphasis and scale and movement, all the things that we've talked about in this series and in the color theory series. We have all of these different tools to describe our work. The way that we choose to use these things is composition. Now, we can describe the composition of anything, even if it's not intentional. You didn't create the mountains, but you can still look at them and describe what you see using the principles of composition. What we're doing is we're learning how to identify and manipulate these principles so that we can create a composition that is accurate to what we are imagining in our mind. Like I said before, what we're doing is learning and practicing tools that help us describe and articulate the choices that we make. Now, we're going to cover two kinds of composition today. We're going to focus primarily on perceptual composition, and then we're going to touch a little bit on narrative composition at the end. Perceptual composition is what you see. It's the visual aspect of composition, how things are placed and how we move around the scene with our eyes and with our body. I've broken perceptual composition into a few key points: focus, framing, and paths. We talked about focus when we discussed balance and emphasis, but I want to go over some more examples of how we can control focus when dealing with all the different principles at once. These are very simple exercises to show you more of what I mean. Different elements of design have different weights. Our first example here uses scale to control the balance. It's pretty straightforward how we can change the balance by changing the size. We go over here and remove some blocks. That's more balanced. But we can also put those back and add more over here. Now, things don't have to be the exact same to be balanced, but this is just a general example of using size to create balance. But what about this one? Color has a tremendous amount of weight in a composition. Contrasting colors is one of the most common ways to create emphasis. So how do we use some of the other elements to balance this out? In this case, I'm going to use scale and movement. Now, if we just use scale and we increase the scale over here, we're just adding more stone. Now, this kind of works, but I could also argue that this actually increases the focus on the green block. Before, it was just a green block and some stone, but now we have one that is dramatically different than all the ones over here. I think the more that we add, the more this will actually stand out. So let's take advantage of the eye being pulled towards the green block instead of fighting against it by making kind of an arch out of the stone that points to it. So if when we look at this, the eye immediately goes this way, you may as well emphasize that with something else that draws the eye this way. Now this creates kind of a circular path for the eye to follow around, and the eye wants to keep going back to follow it back around to the green. It's a very simple example, but it shows the principle pretty well. When we're dealing with a little more complex example, we have more ways that we can choose from to examine and change the composition. More focus is put on the door. The color stands out, there's more depth, there's more contrast, there's different textures, and that could be exactly what you want. Maybe you want the focus to stay on the door and keep that as the focal point, but maybe you don't. So what are some ways that we can balance this out and make this a little bit more even on both sides? Well, there's a lot of things we could do. To start, we could maybe bring the mangrove wood over. We could put a window in to draw the eye over a little. Or maybe we'll just increase the complexity of the design in order to create a little more interest. These are all different ways that you can increase the weight over here and make this a little more cohesive. Personally, I like to keep the focus on the door because that's where people are going to be going and entering. Knowing where to put things can be just as tricky as knowing what to put there. This is called framing or staging a scene. There are tons of different ways to frame a scene, but we're going to go over just a couple common techniques that you're going to see a lot. First up is the rule of thirds. When we cut a frame into thirds, vertically and horizontally, we end up with these lines and these intersections. Placing points of interest along these lines and then focal points on the intersections tends to work very well. Now, I'm not sure if there's something inherent about these points and about this layout that we're drawn to, or if we just see it so much that we're accustomed to understand it as good composition, but you will see this everywhere once you know what you're looking for. Now, the size of the frame doesn't matter. As long as you're dividing it up into equal thirds, the same thing applies. Now, next up is symmetry. This creates a very balanced, focused frame. Like I said before, this is great when you're building things like shrines, monuments, capitals, things like that. It gives off a sense of importance and correctness that fits well with those. You may notice that making these asymmetrical, like moving the line too far to the left or right or up and down, is going to place things in the intersections of the rule of thirds. Now, here we have diagonals. Diagonals are great for moving the eyes around a composition. They create a lot of movement, and just like the rule of thirds, using things along the lines and then putting focal points at the intersections works really nicely. Perspective lines are diagonal as well, and it pulls the eye in or up and away depending on how you use them. For example, if you have a focal point in the center, using things like roofs or cliff walls to frame that in along these diagonals will help pull the eye into the center. And over here, we have what a lot of people refer to as the golden ratio or the golden rule or the Fibonacci ratio. These are all good names for it. All this is creating a spiral based off the Fibonacci sequence and then placing points of interest or compositional elements along that line. This is very common. People like it because the Fibonacci sequence is very interesting. Spirals are awesome, so that's really cool. But I don't think that this is inherently a good way to compose a scene. And in my opinion, it's kind of a gimmick because people tend to use it and think that that makes their composition good instead of making a good composition and then adjusting it to fit within these parameters. Still a cool trick though. Now, you might be thinking, Goose, this is all great, but this is Minecraft. Things aren't flat and stationary. Things are 3D and we can move around. And to that, I say, there are two kinds of paths that we're going to cover. Paths that show movement around a scene, and the paths that show movement through a scene. I covered both of these when talking about perceptual movement in the line and movement section, but I'll give a quick recap. Movement around a scene is still in the realm of 2D. This is a path that your eye follows when you look at something. Maybe up the path into the house, or maybe it starts at the house and then is drawn down here. Movement through a scene is when we dive into the realm of 3D. This is the path that an environment encourages you to take when you're moving around. Now, I want to address something. When I spoke about this before in the movement and line episode, a lot of you commented things like, you should just go this way because there's loot off the intended path, or I would just go straight over the hill, not around it. These are all completely valid, and I also do the same thing. Who else completely missed the first guide stones when they played through Skyrim for the first time because they immediately went off the path? But you might be missing out on some really cool shots and scenes that an environment artist spent a lot of time on. I need to make a quick shout out to the team that made one of my all-time favorite games, Journey. It is an absolutely masterful execution of perceptual movement and composition in general. If you are at all interested in the stuff that I talk about, and you haven't played through Journey, I would say that it is essential material to experience and study. Now I have a small scale example here that we're going to dissect a little bit and discuss the composition. Because you can't really make sure that every angle is well composed, it can be useful to pick 2 or 3 and make them into a kind of keyframe, point of interest where you can really dial in on the composition. This will create a well-composed scene from multiple angles, and it'll help it feel consistent while you're moving through it. Now the 2 keyframes I have right here is that green block and this red one right here. So let's talk about the composition. Over here, we have a pretty heavily weighted area. There's a lot of buildings, there's a mountain behind it, there's a lot more texture, there's more interest going on here. Now, if we just had that and the bridge and then this tower, it would feel weighted to the right side. I also wanted to create more depth and a little bit more scale, so I put this building right here. It's large, it's in the foreground, and it's also blocking out this whole section. This is going to put a lot of weight on the left side, and it's going to balance it out. In terms of the focal point, I would say the bridge is probably the main focal point because A, it's in the center, it's at a horizon line, and it's a different color. This is going to pull the eye left and right, and it's going to encourage the eye to look back and forth and around this to examine the entire picture instead of just one spot. Now, if we go over to the other keyframe, we have a much different composition. It's a little more symmetrical, with the river going straight down the middle and the bridge over top. And because we have so many buildings leading up this way, creates a lot of depth and movement of the eye up into that area. Then we use the color of the trees and this little building over here to help balance it on the right. Now those are the paths around the image, but what about the paths through the image? Actual paths are a great way to deal with this. As we move around, this moves in a good kind of circular motion. In this case, we'd be going through that building and over into this point that I would say is the main focus. There's the most going on, there's a lot of detail you can add, and you get a pretty good view of everything from this point. On my last video about scale, someone pointed out something very interesting that they wanted to hear about, and this is what's called forced perspective. Forced perspective is when you vary things, especially the scale, to make things look bigger or smaller than they actually are, because, like almost all the other elements, scale is relative. So something will appear bigger when it's surrounded by other things that look smaller. A great example here is just using the azalea bushes in place of trees. They make it feel just a little bit more like this is a scaled miniature rather than just a few blocks stacked up on each other. I wanted to look into this more, so I made another example focusing on forced perspective. Now here we have 4 stages of distance. We have the foreground that's the closest, we have one that's a little farther, then we have some stuff in the background, and then we have the far background over here. Now, this is only 30 or so blocks across, but by using different sizes and different blocks, we can make it look like it goes down into a large valley, even though it's really close. Doing things like making trees out of fences and leaves that are a lot smaller are great for this. The azalea bushes are great, and finding tricky ways to kind of mimic the color and texture of a house like this can be really useful as well. In the back, we don't need as much detail, so just a little touch of mangrove does the trick. The farther away something gets, the less detail we're going to be able to see on it. So if we mimic that by making it smaller and putting less detail, it can trick the mind into thinking that it's farther away. Over here, I built the same entryway in a bunch of different scales as if they were getting farther away. Now here's the main entryway. This is how we would build it if we were up close. But let's say we want to make it look like it's farther away. The farther away we go, the less detail we add, until at the end, it has the same general impact as this, but when we really get up to it, it's only a couple blocks high, and there's not really much detail at all. This can be great for doing things like building a small village on the side of a mountain, up behind a main build. It'll make the mountain look a lot bigger and farther away, and it can also make building things easier knowing that if they're viewed from far away, you really don't have to put as much detail into them. Now, of course, this falls apart if it's a situation where someone can go over here and walk up to it, but when you're dealing with keyframe compositions, or you're just making a scene, or you want to add some detail in the distance, this can be very, very useful. Now, that covers most of the basics of perceptual composition. There's a lot more. This is just touching on the basics, so please look into it more, ask questions. There's a lot of other stuff we can talk about. But when it really comes down to it, it's taking all of these elements that we've talked about and finding ways to place and arrange and utilize them to make a build or a scene or a setting or an environment more interesting or more in line with the image that we had in our head. I know I run into this a lot where I have an image in my head, and the second I start building it, it kind of starts changing and fading away in my mind. This can be very frustrating, but the more that we practice these tools, the better we will get at pulling what we have in our mind out and putting it in front of us. We can think of it literally as a big block of marble, and all of the tools that we talk about are the tools and the chisels that we will use to carve out the thing that we want to see. But there is more to it. And one of those things that we're going to touch on is called narrative composition. Now, we're going to touch really briefly on this because this could be an entire channel talking about how to compose a narrative and how to use that to influence your builds. So we're just going to talk about some basic properties of it. The first point that I want to make about narrative composition is that things have a much different weight when they're viewed in context. Even though I made this completely plain and we have a lot more detail and contrast here, there is one block that I can add that will change all of that. That's all it takes. Now, that is red, and so there's a lot of visual contrast there, but we also know in context that TNT is going to blow up. Especially in Minecraft, the TNT block holds a ton of weight because of the narrative context of us knowing that it's explosive. But there's something we can do that'll make it even more. Just put a pressure plate next to it, and we can increase it even more by putting a chicken there. I bet your eye's not going to leave that for very long. Are you going to do it? What if we add some more? It increases the tension because we know
of the inherent consequences of having that situation there. That's a great example of narrative composition. Narrative composition is essential when you're world building. We have to use visual cues to show people what the building is about. Now here we have just a general building, but if we move over here a little bit, we see some hay bales and some targets. That just screams archery range right there. And then if we continue inside, we can see things like the bows on the wall, we have some feathers and strings, sticks on the ground for making arrows. All of these things are little visual cues that are going to help explain what the build is about and what's happening in the world. Those are the basics of what narrative composition means when you look at it visually. Block palette can have a big impact as well, using things like cracked stone bricks instead of new stone bricks, or using mossy cobble instead of normal cobble, all have an impact on the narrative feel and the narrative composition of a build. Using more iron blocks and concrete and glass might make something look more modern, and then decorating it with certain things can change the way that someone views a build. Giving little narrative hints can really enhance the way that a build feels and the immersion associated with it. Composition is very subjective. And like I've said before, these tools are not here to make something better in one way or another. These tools are here so that you can learn how to use them to better articulate the image that you have in your mind and bring it forward into real life. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching through all of that. I really appreciate you guys. You guys have been doing an amazing job of supporting me in this channel. I do want to talk just for a sec about the future of this channel and some announcements that I have. First up, the biggest one is starting at the end of June. There's no set date yet, but starting in the end of June, I will be a new member on the Craftworks SMP for Season 2. I'm very excited about this. I've never done an SMP before. I think I'm going to love it. I hope you guys love it too. So those videos will start coming out this summer. I am going to continue doing videos like this. I still have several things in the pipeline right now, like the deep dive into color theory video. I know you guys have been waiting a long time for that, but I am doing a ton of research for it. I'm putting a lot of work into it, and I think you guys are going to really enjoy it when it comes out. It should be pretty soon. I'm also working on some terraforming videos similar to the design and color theory videos. And then I have 2 secret projects that I'm working on as well. These are taking a lot more production than these ones, so they're going to be a little bit more involved. They're going to take a little bit longer, but they are coming, and I think you're going to enjoy them very much. So again, thank you all so much. As always, there's a link down below for the Discord if you want to come and join. It's been awesome. It's been a lot of fun talking with everybody. We've been very active lately, and I love you guys. I hope you have a great day whenever you're watching this, and I hope the day after that day is really good, and several more after that, but not too many. Not too many. Yeah. All right. I'll see you later.